Welcome to the Jacob Hornberger Show. Nice to be back with you guys. Going to talk to you tonight about the latest assassination on the part of the U.S. government. As we all know, they've been assassinating people for many, many years now. But yesterday, or the day before yesterday, they assassinated two more Americans. Now, I say two more Americans because they assassinated an American back in 2002 in the same country, by the way, Yemen. And then over the weekend, they assassinated an American named Anwar al-Awlaki and then another American that was traveling with him under the rationale that under the war on terrorism, they have the authority to assassinate anyone they wish as long as they believe that he's a terrorist. Now, you know, if you've been reading our material at the Future of Freedom Foundation, you know, ever since 9/11, we've said that this is the logical consequence of their rationale here for this war on terrorism. I mean, this doesn't surprise us. It shouldn't surprise any American, because if you go back and you look at their language after 9/11, it was clear that they were wielding the authority, the new authority, revolutionary legal authority, to assassinate and torture and incarcerate any American simply by labeling him a terrorist. And their determination of what a terrorist is pretty much conclusive. So, you know, remember they were talking about, you know, right after 9/11, the global war on terror. Well, we caught that. You know, it's not just, you know, Afghanistan. It's not just Iraq. They're talking about the entire world being a battlefield in this now new war on terrorism, the new official enemy, terrorism. And we pointed out at the time, you know, some 10 years ago, we said, if it's global, that includes the United States. And, you know, and they were making it look like, well, Americans are different. Americans are different. You know, we won't send Americans to Guantanamo. Well, how gracious of you, you know. But we kept saying that there's nothing that prevents them from doing this under their self-proclaimed authority. So, for example, they took Jose Padilla, an American citizen, into custody, extracted him from the judicial system, the federal judicial system, put him in a military dungeon, and then proceeded to torture him mentally for some 3.5 years. Also attempted to deny him right to counsel. I mean, they were treating him as they called it, as an enemy combatant, one that had no rights, even under the Geneva Convention, they said, because he's an illegal enemy combatant. And that included Americans, they said. And this is why, as I've pointed out in previous shows and in my many articles on the Jose Padilla case over the years, that they chose the Padilla case because, you know, people didn't have much sympathy for Padilla. But what we kept emphasizing at the Future of Freedom Foundation is that the reason they chose an unsympathetic person to establish this regulation in was because they knew what we knew, and that was going to be that it always was going to apply to all Americans. That if they could prevail in the right to have military supremacy, the military in control of this country, being able to just seize a citizen and cart him away, put him in a dungeon, label him a terrorist, torture him, keep him there forever. If they could do it to one American, they could do it to any American. And that was their position with Padilla, that as soon as they received orders of their commander-in-chief, they would carry them out. They'd loyally carry them out, go seize Americans, cart them away to a concentration camp, a dungeon. It doesn't matter what label you want to put on it. And they got an appellate court opinion in favor of that authority. And we've argued ever since that has revolutionized the American way of life. But we also said that it's not just torture, that we're also dealing with the power of assassination, the authority to assassinate people. I mean, imagine. I mean, if I had told you 30 years ago that the Soviet Union was assassinating people, was torturing people, was barging down people's doors and taking them into custody, and the military and the Gestapo was putting them in dungeons and torturing them and keeping them there without trial, you would say, well, yeah, duh. Jacob, they're communists. I mean, you know, How can this surprise anyone? But we would all look at it in a despicable fashion. We'd say, yeah, they're communists. Or if, even today, if I told you that they were doing such things under the military dictatorship in Burma or Egypt or China or North Korea, we'd all say, oh, God, that's horrible. But they're totalitarians, they're communists or whatever. And here we are in this country. I mean, it absolutely boggles the mind that we live in a country where the government is assassinating its own citizens that wields this authority. And it's not just authority to do it in Yemen. It's the authority to do it right here in the United States, because remember, the global war on terrorism, the entire world's a battlefield. And so what they do is they sneak in the back door or they sneak in the side door. And they say, well, yeah, we have authority to kill this American in Yemen. But the logical consequence of that is they've got authority to assassinate anybody, anywhere, because it's a global war on terrorism. And we said at the time, after 9/11, we said this thing's better than the Cold War. I mean, it's better than the drug war. I remember one article I wrote saying, the drug war just goes on and on and on. It's gone on like for 30 years, which gives them unlimited power virtually. I mean, not unlimited power, but a lot of power in the drug war. I mean, we've seen it grow exponentially, the searches and the seizures and the spying and the monitoring and the setups, and now they're thinking about sending the military to the border. I mean, it just goes on and on. And of course, it never ends, right? I mean, drug war, 30, 40 years, it never ends. They say it still has to go on. And I said after 9/11, I said this war on terrorism, it's going to be better than the drug war. Because it produces its own supply of terrorists. The more the empire does bad things to people overseas, which is what it had been doing before 9/11, and which, of course, precipitated the anger and the hatred and the rage that manifested itself, not just in 9/11, but the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, the attacks on the USS Cole, the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and the sanctions, the embargoes. I mean, that all of that finally manifests itself, and I said, this thing's better than the drug war. It'll go on and on and on. And notice, it's just like the drug war. In the drug war where they knock out a drug cartel, I remember the Cali cartel was a big deal, and Carlos Leader was a big drug dealer, and I remember them saying, boy, this has made a major, when they busted these things, the Cali cartel and Carlos Leader and a bunch of other drug cartels and gangs over the decades, but they'd say, this has made a major dent in the war on drugs and in the supply of drugs. The same thing you hear today. We killed Osama bin Laden, and this has made a major dent in Al-Qaeda, and we've now killed Anwar al-Awlaki, and a major dent here, and a major dent there, and a major dent there. But do you ever see them say, hey, war on terrorism's over, we just killed another guy, big, terrorism leader? No, because it goes on and on and on. This guy, the paper's now reporting he's going to be a martyr, and which means they're going to inspire more people to retaliate for what's going on. I mean, what we really have to be asking ourselves, is this what America is all about? Is this what our nation is all about? Torture, assassination, indefinite detention, invasions, occupations, sanctions, embargoes, partnerships with dictators, rendition, torture partnerships with tortuous dictators, foreign aid. I mean, is this what America is all about? Foreign bases, especially the Cold War bases. Hey, Cold War is over, dude. So it's been about 20 years or so. Is this what America's all about? And I think that's the fundamental question, because you see, and then we got to ask ourselves, is there a solution to all this? Is there a way to restore a sense of normalcy to our land where we don't have this stuff going on, assassination and torture and indefinite detention? I mean, this is not the kind of thing that the framers had in mind, that our founding fathers had in mind. Do you think that this is what Jefferson and Madison and Washington had in mind when they founded our country? that the government would be torturing people, including Americans, that the government would be assassinating people, including Americans, sanctioning, embargo, entangling alliances with dictators, making torture partnerships with dictators where they torture on your behalf. I just can't imagine that Washington and Madison and Jefferson and the founding fathers had this in mind for our country. And so, what we've got to do is we can't just fight this thing on a step by step basis. Where we say, oh well, let's fight them over here that they don't have the legal authority to do the torture and they don't have the legal authority to do the assassinations and the searches and seizures and the NSA spying and the monitoring of emails, and it just goes on and on and on. And so what we really need to be doing, and this is what we've done at the Future of Freedom Foundation, is that we don't just, we can't just trim the branches of the weed. I mean, to get rid of a weed, you've got to pull it out by its roots. And the roots of this weed are very, very thick. They've been growing for many, many decades. And they're just deep. They're very deep, but they're strangling the foundations of liberty and individualism and spontaneous order and free markets and individualism and limited government on which our government, our nation was founded. And so that's what I'd like to share with you tonight is these fundamental principles, the founding principles of America. Let's start there, and then start to understand how a new foundation became overlaid on the founding foundation of this country. And this new foundation, I would argue, is the bad foundation. It's like an overlay on the original foundation that obscures the original foundation. And it's a cancerous overlay. One that's just, metastasizing, eating away at the body politic, eating away at our freedom, eating away at our prosperity, and eating away at our national character, the character of the American people that were once known for things that involved, honorable things. There's nothing honorable about having a nation that's out assassinating and invading and occupying, killing. Now, they'll say, oh, well, this has been brought upon us. We have no choice. It's just like, the flu. I mean, we were just sitting here minding our own business and the flu hit. And terrorism, they came and got us, and so now we don't have any choice but to defend ourselves. Nonsense. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is what nonsense all that is. That there really is a cause for what's going on here. There's a root cause as to how we are today as a country, where the government's doing the things that, I'll be honest with you, when I was a kid growing up, I was taught that things like torture and assassination, that's stuff that communists did, that Nazis did, that barbarians did. To me, it's just shocking that not only is the government doing these things, but there's actually people out there supporting it and defending it, including, as we all know now, in the presidential race. You got Obama supporting assassination and torture and all that. Oh, he'll say he's against torture, but give me a break. You're in favor of assassination, but you're not in favor of torture. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, of course, he's given immunity to all the people that were guilty of torture, that did commit torture. And this is just not what America's about. And you can look at all the other presidential candidates, except Ron Paul, of course. Not surprisingly, he stands out again and is opposing the assassination of the American people. And that's really what it is. It's not just assassination of this guy. It's the authority of the government to assassinate Americans. And let's not let them off the hook on this, where they say, oh, well, it was just this guy. No, that's your precedent. Now you've established a precedent that you have the authority to assassinate Americans without any trial, without any due process of law. They say he's a terrorist. I said, oh, really? Where is his conviction? Oh, but Jacob, it's an act of war. Oh, then why does the Justice Department have, I don't know how many terrorists that they're trying to get accused terrorists in federal court today? Why have they had so many accused terrorists in federal court in the last, 10 years? You know, if it's an act of war, gentlemen, then explain to me why terrorism is in the U.S. Code. Why do federal grand juries indict for it? You see, and this is their charade. They knew after 9/11 that it was a criminal offense. It's always been a criminal offense. That's how they got the guy, the terrorist that attacked the World Trade Center in '93. They captured him. They didn't treat it as an act of war. They didn't go bomb Pakistan and kill a bunch of innocent people and generate this endless war on terrorism. They waited the guy out. They took him into custody in Pakistan. They whisked him back to the United States. They had him indicted by a federal grand jury. They prosecuted. They convicted him. He's now sitting in a federal penitentiary. Now, if that's an act of war, then why did they do all that? Well, the fact is that terrorism is a criminal offense, and what they did, they pulled a little sleight of hand after 9/11. They said, "Oh, well, now we're going to have an option. We're going to put the military in charge, and the military is going to have the trump power over the federal judiciary. So if we decide that we're going to send him into the military, no federal judge can interfere with us." And in fact, it gets even better than that. Under their new system now, post 9/11, the military can sit in a federal terrorism case, sit in the front row, bunch of, Army sergeants, military intelligence, whatever. They can sit in the front row of a federal courtroom, and they can just stare at that jury and stare at that judge, and everybody knows that they have the ultimate power. The military does now. That even if the jury acquits a guy of terrorism, the military can ignore that jury verdict. They can tell the judge to go fly a kite, and the judge is going to be nervous anyway, because the judges get real nervous when all this military national security stuff come up. And let's say the jury acquits. Under our system of justice now, the military can stand up, not say a word, take that guy into custody, and take him away to a prison camp and torture him, execute him, whatever. They don't have to honor that jury verdict. That's the system under which we live now. And it's a remarkable thing because it's all been done without a constitutional amendment, without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment. Even Congress didn't get in the act. It's an emergency power. Emergency has been in existence now for 10 years. That is going on indefinitely. But let's go back to founding principles, because unless we understand how this overlay came into existence, this cancerous overlay that's tearing our country apart, then it's very difficult to talk in terms of what we need to do. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight too, is what we need to do to get this country back on the right track. And in order to do that, we need to understand principles. Now, let's go back to the founding of America. You've got your Declaration of Independence that every individual, everybody is entitled to or has fundamental, inherent, God-given natural rights, life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And we can talk about what the meaning of those terms are, but those are the fundamental rights of every individual, not just Americans, every individual. So the Constitution is proposed. We jump forward from 1776 to 1787. The Constitution's proposed, and it purports to call into existence the federal government. Now, a lot of people were not in favor of this. A lot of Americans, they were just said, no, let's continue to live under the Articles of Confederation. Now, there was a federal government under the Articles of Confederation, but it had extremely weak powers. It didn't even have the power to tax, And it was truly a confederation of states that had come together and said, hey, let's form a confederation of states, each state being sovereign, like a little mini nation, and we're going to come together in a confederation with a very weak federal government. Well, so the Constitution comes along, and they're establishing a more powerful federal government, and Americans had tremendous misgivings. Now, why is this? Well, because they were concerned that this new government that was being called into existence would become the destroyer of their freedom and prosperity. I mean, isn't that amazing? They didn't trust their own government. And the framers were trying to tell them, look, everything's going to be fine. You don't need to have this concern. And they said, hey, what do you mean don't have this concern? They said, well, this is our own government. Well, the British government was their government too. And they seceded from that government because it had become a destroyer of their freedom and their well-being. And so they were very concerned. They knew that one's own government is really the biggest threat to their freedom and well-being. So they said, hey, we don't want to have anything to do with this thing. And so the framers said, look, you don't need to worry because this is a government that's going to have just a few enumerated powers. It's not going to have the power to do whatever it wants. It's not going to have the power to, act in the public interest, to enact whatever laws or decrees or take whatever measures it thinks are right. That it's actually going to be limited in its powers, and here are its powers. So people could see it as well. These are very small number of powers, and the framer said that's right, and that's all they can do. So it was the first time in history where people were calling a government into existence under express conditions. Now, the people were still very suspicious. The Americans, our ancestors, and said, look, if you want to call this government into existence, all right, we'll go with the deal. But only if you promise to enact a Bill of Rights immediately after the government's brought into existence. And what was the purpose of the Bill of Rights? Well, it really should be called a Bill of Prohibitions. That what it does is it expressly prohibits the government from exercising certain powers. The power to interfere or infringe on people's speech or religious liberty or, their right to keep and bear arms. Their pre-existing fundamental rights that Jefferson had enunciated in the Declaration. And, well, the framers at first said, you don't need this. Because why do you need to expressly prohibit them from exercising these powers if they're not enumerated in the Constitution? They can't exercise them anyway. So you don't really need this. The Americans said, fine, we like your enumerated powers doctrine, but it's not good enough for us. We just don't trust this government. We think it will become the destroyer of our freedom, the destroyer of our prosperity. And they were looking back through, all the way to the Middle Ages and so forth of their own government, the British government, that had tortured them, that had assassinated them, that had seized them and carted them away to the Tower of London and done all sorts of bad things, taken their property from them without any compensation. I mean, they had their ancestors had had centuries of this tyrannical, abusive, horrific conduct against their own citizenry. And so they said, we want to make sure, and we want these things enunciated as prohibitions in this so-called Bill of Rights. And so there it is. I mean, you look at the First Amendment. The First Amendment doesn't give people rights. Read it carefully. It says the government, Congress, the president, will not deprive people of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Now, why did they feel they needed to do that? Because they believed that the government was the great destroyer of their freedom. It was the greatest threat, that it would do these things. It would take away their freedom of speech. It would do what totalitarian dictators have done throughout history, whether it was democratically elected or not. It would come and start doing these things. And then there was, because you just got this political class that government attracts that are by and large statists, people of this kind of ilk, this kind of mindset that believe in order and stability and can't stand the thought that people are behaving in ways that the majority doesn't approve of. And then, of course, they had the Fourth and Fifth and Sixth and Eighth Amendments dealing with what we call civil liberties. Now, what this was all about was, the people really feared the government having the most tyrannical power of all, the power to just go out and seize a citizen and arrest him. Mostly like for what he was speaking about, exposing government wrongdoing, criticizing the king, criticizing the legislature. They hate that. I mean, they really hate it. Why do you think the totalitarian dictators in China immediately put somebody in jail when he starts speaking about the government? Because statists hate that, especially statists living in the government. They look at government like a god, like it's their be-all and end-all. And so, to prevent this from happening, that our ancestors said, no, we want these express protections that have come up through the ages in resistance to the tyranny of our own government, the British government. And that before you go pick somebody up, you've got to have an arrest warrant based on probable cause issued by a magistrate, an independent magistrate. And then in order to put him in jail, you've got to go through a bunch of obstacles, grand jury indictments, right to counsel, right to cross-examine witnesses, a presumption of innocence, trial by jury instead of a judge determining somebody's guilt or a tribunal or experts. They said, no, we want regular people to be deciding the guilt or innocence of the accused and whether the law under which they're being accused is a just law. So the jury was the final arbiter of guilt or innocence. And right to bail, right to speedy trial, so that they couldn't keep you in jail forever, saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to charge you one of these days. We're going to try you one of these days." All these were like barbed wire entanglements because people were so concerned about this tyrannical power of governments throughout history to just go and seize citizens and cart them away. And when you stop to think about it, it's really the most powerful power of all. I mean, somebody asked me a while back, they said, what do you think is the greatest infringement of freedom in our lifetime? And I didn't hesitate. It's the enemy combatant doctrine. I mean, through this doctrine, they finally were able to work their way around the Bill of Rights. They simply now have the authority to go do what the Bill of Rights was intended to prohibit, to seize a citizen, call him a terrorist, cart him away, torture him, put him in a military dungeon, put him in a concentration camp, and keep him there forever. I mean, it's essentially what they did to Japanese Americans in World War II, but with no war going on. Okay, they call it a war on terrorism. It's no different from the war on drugs or the war on poverty and the war on illiteracy. It's these, wars on a tactic or war on a noun or whatever. But there's no nation state in terms of, Japan or Germany in World War II. It's like waging war against the drug dealers. Well, we're at war, Jacob. We're at war. It's ridiculous. Okay, because drug offense is in the U.S. Code as a crime, and so is terrorism. But this is how they got around the Bill of Rights. After over 200 years, they got around the Bill of Rights, and they just said, well, we're at war, and so now we don't have to go through these. Or if we want to go through them, it's our option. If we want to send a suspected terrorist down the federal court route, we can do that. If we want to send him into the military clutches, we can do that. So it's not really an either-or thing under their mindsets. It's more of, well, we concede it's a federal criminal offense, but we have the authority to treat it any way we want now, post 9/11. And so our generations have this distinction of, after 200 years, we were the first generations to permit the government to circumvent, as a matter of policy, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. I mean, it's really something to be ashamed about because people have fought for these principles for so long, and government's been bashing at them. The statists have been bashing at them, especially in the drug war. But people have hung fast and stood fast, trial by jury, even when you're convinced that the guy's a drug dealer and so forth. But here is where our generations have the shame on our backs, the shame of having relinquished to them the ability to and the authority to circumvent the Bill of Rights by all they have to do is just label somebody a terrorist. And okay, sure, somebody can file a petition for writ of habeas corpus, but as things are turning out, it's a nullity. All they got to do is show up with a little modicum of evidence, claim national security, state secrets or whatever, and the federal judge is going to quiver and quake and say, this is wartime and I'm not going to get involved. Now, we see this to a certain extent in the Alaki case. Alaki's father brings a civil action against the government, asking that the government be, enjoined from assassinating his son. I mean, this was before he was assassinated. And, the argument that he's making is, look, this government doesn't have the authority under our system of justice to go out and assassinate citizens. I mean, you've got to go to a trial and convict a person before you can punish him. And then there's also a prohibition against cruel and unusual punishments in the Bill of Rights. So what the father is saying is that when you go out and execute a guy, I mean, duh, you're not giving him a trial. You're punishing him with no due process, no grand jury indictment, and so forth. I mean, it'd be like, let's say they're certain that a guy's a drug dealer, and let's say the drug dealer gets up on TV and says, I'm a drug dealer, I've been selling, 1,000 kilos a day of marijuana into the United States. And then they go into, let's say, Mexico and just assassinate the guy. And they say, well, we have his confession. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that we, the people, have established a system that they have to follow even when everyone agrees that the person is guilty of the crime. They have to go through these obstacles. They have to go through a grand jury indictment. They have to go through, a trial. They have to do all these things before they can punish the guy. And if it's a death penalty offense, they can give him the death penalty. But if they can't execute him if it's not a death penalty case. So what they're doing with Alaki is saying, we don't need to do that. We don't need a trial. Who needs any stinking trial? We know he's a terrorist. And we say, but wait a minute, don't you accuse people of terrorism sometimes in the federal courts and they're acquitted? Oh, well, yeah, but what are those juries? No, those juries are dumb. They don't know what they're doing. So why go through the time and expense of a trial? Might as well just go execute guilty people. I mean, why don't we do that with murderers? The terrorist is a murderer, right? So when the state's convinced that somebody's a murderer, has even got a confession on, just execute him. Well, the reason we don't is because that's not our system of justice. We don't let the government make these decisions. That was the whole idea of the civil liberties aspects of the Bill of Rights. We don't care how convinced you are that a person's guilty. You have to go through this. It is not your determination that makes the decision. You can accuse the person of it, but that's what a grand jury indictment is. You go to a grand jury and you make the case for the accusation. Then you come into court and you make your case before a jury. That's not what they're claiming now. They're claiming we don't have to do that anymore. That we can go out and assassinate and execute Americans without any due process of law, without any jury trial, without anything. And so Alaki's father comes in and he files this lawsuit on behalf of his son and says, look, this is not what America's all about. This is what totalitarian countries are all about. They may be totally convinced my son is doing horrible things, that he's a terrorist, that he's supporting terrorists, all of which may be true. But under our system of justice, you don't go and assassinate him. You do your best to bring him to justice. And that is in a federal criminal case because, oh, by the way, terrorism is a federal crime. It's on the U.S. Code. They're bringing terrorism cases every day, okay? And, well, guess what the federal judge says to Alaki's father? Well, first of all, the prosecutors say the magic word, which the magic word that sends every federal judge, or practically every federal judge, quivering and quaking. National security, Your Honor. And the federal judge, his knees start knocking, and he gets these visions that national security is at stake, and oh my gosh, the nation's going to fall, and the terrorists are going to be running the federal judiciary, and the federal judges are going to lose their jobs, and there's going to be terrorists on every federal bench. And, I mean, it's ridiculous, but that's how they feel. All the government's got to do is say the magic words. National security, and state secrets. That's a new one, too. That, Your Honor, if we have to answer this lawsuit, we'd have to disclose our standards by which we're assassinating people. And that would be a state secret, and that would jeopardize national security. So the federal judge says, well, you don't have standing anyway, Mr. Alaki, that only your son can have standing, and he doesn't come into court. Now, does there seem to be something wrong with that picture? I mean, all these, it's amazing because these federal judges, you think, man, they go to college, they go to law school, man, these guys must be brilliant guys, right? Federal judge, Mr. Honorable Federal Judge. They're trying to assassinate this guy. Hello? They've got him on their assassination list. What do you think is going to happen when this man files his lawsuit and walks up to the federal courtroom to make his case to you? They're going to have snipers on your federal building and they're going to take him out. I mean, that's the whole point here. This judge is saying, well, he really should have filed his lawsuit and gotten out of his car and walked over. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's just inane. Yeah, they won't assassinate him when he's on his way to the federal building. Yeah, right. It's ridiculous. He's on their assassination list. They would have the assassins on buildings, on looking out of windows and high rises and aiming their guns and ready to go after this guy. So the father brings this lawsuit on behalf of the son. The judge said, no, that doesn't count. And that you can't do this. And oh, by the way, even if the son were here, this is state secrets and national security, and we're at war. I mean, back to this nonsense about war. We warned about this. I mean, from the very beginning at the Future of Freedom Foundation, we said this is a huge deal, that they're calling terrorism a war, a situation of war, which is going to open the floodgates up. And sure enough, it has. I mean, Obama's now got his helmet on, his commander-in-chief helmet, and he's got the power to assassinate Americans. I mean, it's just so, and you see conservatives supporting him, which is absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, Osama knows that the economy's in the tank, and so he's trying to outmaneuver the conservatives on assassinating people, the war on terrorism, tough in foreign affairs and stuff, and he's outmaneuvered them because they don't know what to do. You've got, Perry and I think Romney, supporting this thing, boy, yeah, this is a good thing that Obama's done. And, what are they going to do in the general election if Perry or Romney's nominated? They're going to have to praise him for his assassinations and his war on terrorism. The fascinating thing really would be if Ron Paul were to win this nomination, because it'd be fun for one thing, because you'd have the liberals who feel abandoned by Obama on civil liberties and foreign policy. I mean, really, this is George Bush's, third term in office. There's no difference between Bush and Obama, and no difference at all. And so you would have the liberals, knowing that he's abandoning them, having a candidate on the Republican side that is more in line with their anti-statist foreign policy views and their pro-civil liberties views. But then you'd have the Republicans that they would be sympathetic to Ron Paul's economic liberty views and the Federal Reserve and taxation and so forth, but they would hate him for his foreign policy pro-civil liberties thing. They'd be tempted to vote for Obama for those reasons. I mean, it'd be kind of humorous in a way, kind of fun. In any event, that was the founding principles of America. Now, John Quincy Adams said, this nation does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And what he meant was that the government's not going to go abroad to kill tyrants and kill dictators and assassinate, these malevolent people, assassinate people that were killing people. The government just wasn't going to do that. And Quincy Adams said that if America ever moves in that direction, she will become the dictatress of the world. Now, he used the feminine version, but it's the dictator of the world. Now, what's a dictator? A dictator is a person that's out there with omnipotent power, the power to torture and assassinate and take people into custody and hold them indefinitely. And I mean, that's what a dictator is. This is what John Quincy Adams was saying, that America's going to become like a dictator, or will be a dictator of the world, where it's doing the kind of things that, oh, by the way, we're looking at now. Assassinating, torturing, entering into torture partnerships with dictators. I mean, this is what John Quincy Adams was saying, that if the government gets this power ever in the future, that it would become like a dictator. Now, at the same time, you've got Madison saying that of all the enemies to liberty, war is the biggest. Okay, because war encompasses all the rest of the infringements on liberty. Now, he's talking about the federal government. The federal government is being the enemy of liberty. Of all the enemies to liberty that the government furnishes, that the government becomes, war is the biggest because it encompasses all of them. And it has debts and taxes. And with debts and taxes come, the oppression of the people. Sound familiar? Now, they believed in no standing army. No standing military establishment. No military industrial complex. No foreign bases. No occupations of other countries. No occupations of here in the United States. No bases in towns and cities all across the country. No, big military industrial complex where, thousands of people in the private sector are now dependent on this vast military machine. All right? So you've got this spontaneous order, this free society. Now, granted, there were exceptions, slavery being the big one, and others like tariffs and so forth. But for a large segment of society, you had this spontaneous order, this free society, where people were free to choose which way to go when it came to irresponsible decisions or immoral decisions, and no drug war and everything. As long as their conduct was peaceful, no murder, rape, stealing, and so forth. It was a remarkable society. People kept everything they earned. No welfare. They said, if you don't want to honor your mother and father, you don't want to help the poor, you don't want to give to your church, you don't have to. That's really what freedom's all about. So that was the foundation of America. That was the solid foundation, and gradually, things got better, and the slaves got freed, and you look at the late 1800s. Sure, there was a lot of corporate government partnerships and a lot of crony capitalism as we know it. But by and large, people kept everything they earned. No Social Security, no Medicare, no standing military establishment, none of this. And then all of a sudden comes 1933. Now, it wasn't a sudden thing. The progressives had been coming up through the 30s, through the turn of the century. Hoover had adopted some of the welfare regulatory provisions. But it was Roosevelt that really revolutionized American society with the welfare state. So overlaying this foundation of freedom, he overlaid a foundation of statism, welfare statism, where the primary purpose of the federal government became taking money from one group of people and giving it to another group of people. Started out with Social Security, but it kept getting larger and larger and larger until we have the gigantic welfare state that we have today. And that overlays, and that's just as big a cancer, or maybe not as big, but almost as big as the warfare state. The welfare state is smothering America. It's impoverishing us. It's destroying the character of self-reliance and can-do, and just the amount of people that are going on the dole is bigger and bigger and bigger every year, and we can see the results of this. But at the same time, around 1947, comes into existence the warfare state. Now, it had been building. It started in 1898 when the U.S. turned toward empire and started occupying Cuba and occupying the Philippines and refused to let them have their independence, and had brutal battles in the Philippines. After liberating them from the Spanish Empire, they said, no, you can't have your independence. You have to be our colony. And the same thing with Cuba. I mean, Cuba was essentially a colony of the U.S. empire. That was the turn of the empire, and you see the militarism taking place in World War I, a total waste of American life, and then building up to World War II, where they partner with the Soviet communists, and then they turn over all of Eastern Europe and East Germany to the Soviet communists, and then they use that as the excuse to say, we need a permanent military establishment in America, and they called it the National Security State. And this magic term came into existence. No one can define it. It's really a cover for the government to do whatever it wants, and to keep it secret. And it came into existence with the National Security Act of 1947, and that brought into existence the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, well, the Pentagon had been built in 43, but clearly they were getting prepared for it on a permanent basis. The CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council, and everything was now national security because the Soviets, our partner and ally that we just delivered Eastern Europe to, is set out to conquer the world. And we must now spread democracy. We must have a permanent military-industrial complex to spread democracy, to protect freedom all over the world. And you know what people said? You know what the libertarians at that time said? Now notice you've got two groups of statists that are overlapping each other. You've got the welfare statists that have propelled America through the welfare statism with this overlaying foundation of statism, welfare statism, combining with the status of the warfare state. Now, there was a big overlap there, but now you've got the overlay of the warfare state, the national security state. And you know what people were saying? They were saying the same thing about the welfare state that they were saying about the warfare state. That is, the libertarians. Hayek, for example, wrote his book, The Road to Serfdom, in 1944. Okay, right near the end of World War II, before the National Security Act is established. Hayek is saying, look at the road that America is now on welfarism. You know, the road to socialism, the road to serfdom, that this is going to impoverish our country, that it's going to deprive our country of freedom, of the spontaneity, what characterized America. You know, self-reliance, can-do, and voluntary charity. There were the libertarians saying the same thing about the warfare state, about the national security state. If you do this in the name of fighting communism or whatever, you're going to have a militarist society, an aggressive empire. You're going to have a regimented society, people glorifying in things like assassination and torture, that this thing's just going to be metastasizing that in a way that threatens to destroy the body politic. And they talked about, if you go back and look at the debates over the National Security Act, the libertarians at that time, we're talking about out-of-control spending, out-of-control debt, that the military, you'd never be able to rein them in, and that the military would become a threat to our democratic processes. Now, Truman saw this. 30 days after the Kennedy assassination, Truman writes an op-ed for the Washington Post where he says, you know, we brought into existence this CIA, but it's turned into a monster. I mean, he didn't use that word, but that's the essence of what he said. He said, you know, when we brought the CIA into existence, it was supposed to be just an agency to coordinate intelligence. That's all. And instead, it's over here ousting, you know, prime ministers of countries and presidents of countries and regime change operations. And Truman said, this is not what America was all about. This is not what we intended. And then you've got Eisenhower that recognized the exact same thing. That the military-industrial complex, this gigantic metastasizing military overlay over our founding principles, was a threat to our democratic processes. That's the President of the United States, who's a retired general. He saw it. And then Kennedy himself started to see it in the days and year or so after in the year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, of how dangerous this huge military-industrial complex was to America. And, of course, ever since then, every president has bought into the national security state. The federal judges buy into it. I mean, that's the idea of the whole statist educational system, that everybody's bought into. Oh, my gosh, national security, oh, my gosh, the whole nation would go down to what? I mean, you know, the whole idea of the national security state was to protect against the former ally, the Soviet Union. Well, hello? I mean, you know, like NATO. You know how NATO was established to protect us against the Soviet Union or protect Western Europe. Hello, Cold War ended 20 years ago, and yet the national security state has stayed and it's grown. It's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And during that time, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dismantling of the Soviet Empire, the U.S. empire, the military, the CIA, they started going over and poking all kinds of hornets' nests, especially in the Middle East. And, you know, I've talked about this and I've written about it. And they, sanctions, embargoes, killing innumerable children, countless children. Madeleine Albright, when she was asked by 60 Minutes, they asked her about the 500,000 children the U.S. government had killed with its empire in sanctions in Iraq, and she said, "Yeah, it's worth it." And so you've got this massive rage forming that then manifests itself in terrorist attacks. Why would that surprise anybody? And and then now we've got the perpetual war on terrorism, where they're telling us, oh, the national security state is more important than ever. Well, but they're generating. You see that the Soviet threat's over. For a while, they tried to make China the official threat. Remember when Bush the second first got into office, and the Chinese shot down that American plane that was overflying Chinese airspace? I mean, the initial idea clearly was, let's make the Chinese communists just as big a threat as the Soviet threat, so that the military overlay, the national security state, can stay, even though the big threat to national security that had formed the basis for the for the Cold War was over. And that didn't work. And they tried to use the drug dealers, where the military says we can get involved in the in the fight against the drugs and so forth. But they went in and they produced the anger and the rage that manifests itself in all these terrorist attacks, including 9/11. And now they use that as the excuse to accomplish in Iraq what the sanctions had not been able to accomplish: regime change in Afghanistan, and this perpetual, terrorist threat that they then use for the Patriot Act, the airport groping, the NSA spying, the illegal searches and seizures, the enemy combatant doctrine, the power to assassinate Americans and foreigners, the power to torture foreigners and Americans, and it's all because of this overlay. Now let me read you what the Washington Post said today. Now here's an article. Americans dip into savings as their incomes decline. Now, this is exactly what people were saying in 1947. The libertarians were saying that with this massive military that now became a permanent part of American life, that this is what it would do, and it would start impoverishing at some point the American people. And so notice that you've got all these problems now economically, and they never once tie them in to the military overlay, this massive military-industrial complex, the national security state. They don't tie it into this overlay of the welfare state. It's all because some nebulous thing of, oh, it's too much speculation, too much freedom, it's the banksters, it's OPEC, it's the, it's everything but, it's the part of society that's not under regulation. It's everything but these two overlays. Well, at the time that the welfare state was coming into existence in the 30s, and after that, you've got libertarians like Hayek saying, this is what's going to happen, that Americans are going to start dipping into their savings, that incomes are going to drop, standards of living are going to drop. And they were saying the same thing in 47 when the warfare state overlay came about. And so this is not coincidence. This is causation. This is what people were saying at the time, that this is an alien way of life. Now, what's the solution to this? You see, because how many people want to live like this? You want to live like this the rest of your life, where you're dipping into your savings, where you can't save any money? I mean, who's saving money these days? Everybody's standard of living is like getting sucked down. And it doesn't have to be. And this is what this is what Hayek was saying in 44. If Americans had listened to Hayek and the Austrians, Ludwig von Mises, and Henry Hazlitt, Leonard Reed, we wouldn't have this garbage today with the welfare state. And the same thing, if they had listened to the individualists, the people that loved limited government, a constitutional republic, we wouldn't have this massive national security state doing all these things. And so now, what's the solution? Well, you can devote your life to reforming this junk, but I don't think cancer can be reformed. I mean, when you go to the doctors and he tells you, hey, you got this cancerous tumor, You don't say, well, hey, let's reform it, doctor. Let's trim around the edges, polish it up a little bit, or cut off chunk. You excise it. And this is what's so important about getting the right diagnosis, because you got to have the right diagnosis to get the right prescription. And I'm giving you the diagnosis. The diagnosis is that your founding principles are obscured. They're darkened. They've got this dark ooze overlaying them. The ooze, it's like oil. It's overlaying the founding principles of this country, and that oozy, oily, um, overlay is the welfare state and the warfare state, and the ooze combines into both forms of statism. And so the real permanent solution to this thing is not just, oh, well, let's reform Social Security, and let's reform Medicare and Medicaid, and let's reform aid to dictators and so forth. No. The real solution is to get these overlays out of the way, to go back and realize that the people that were warning us of the consequences of this way of life were the ones that were in the right. That you lift this welfare state overlay and dismantle it completely. And you lift this military-industrial complex overlay and you dismantle it. You close all those bases. You dismantle the troops. You put them in the private sector. You discharge them. In the taxes that are needed to fund all those things, the debts, the inflation. Oh, that's another thing that people were saying in 47, that if you come into existence with this national security state, permanent military, you're going to have debasement of the currency, ever-growing debt. Hello, that's what we got. And then, of course, inflation, debasement of the currency, which is, what we've had for decades. So you end up closing this thing, dismantling it. In other words, restoring the principles that John Quincy Adams was talking about, restoring the principles that Madison was talking about, that Washington was talking about, no entangling alliances, and then you restore this spontaneous sort of a normal society where Americans are traveling abroad, engaging with other people, interacting with people on a private sector, with a very, very weak government. That's the only solution to this thing. Is you got to get rid of this cancer entirely. You gotta lift it out, these overlays, and dismantle them. Now, is that scary? Well, yeah, it's scary for people that have grown accustomed to this. I mean, was it scary for the Soviet people to be thinking in terms of a free market and the production of shoes and automobiles? Yeah, because when you're born and raised, when the state's producing your shoes and automobiles, that's pretty scary to say, you mean the market's going to produce these things? Well, we've all been born and raised into a welfare state. Social Security, Medicare, aid to dictatorships, farm subsidies, education grants, public schooling. I mean, we've all grown up with the warfare state, the national security state. The idea that we would no longer have this huge military-industrial complex, bases, every town across the country or many towns across the country. I mean, it's like, oh my gosh, how would the nation survive? Well, it's the only way for the nation to survive. I mean, we see what's happening with Greece, and they're just dealing with a welfare state. We've got the welfare state and the warfare state. But at least there's a solution to this. You see, when you see the things going deeper and deeper and deeper, it tends to get depressing unless you know there's a way out. Now, we can't guarantee, we libertarians can't guarantee that Americans are going to take the way out. They may just keep going down in this little death spiral here, economically and militarily and societal-wise. But we've got to keep speaking the truth about what the solution is, because, if there's a solution, then there's room for optimism. There's room for hope. Imagine if there were no libertarians and no libertarianism. Yeah, pretty dark. Sort of like living in, Eastern Europe, in 1950 or so. But there is hope, and that hope is with libertarians and libertarianism. And there's a lot of people, as we all know, that are gravitating toward libertarianism, and that's what makes it exciting. People are figuring out there's cause and effect here. It's not coincidence. It's not like the flu, that these economic problems of low incomes and inability to save and joblessness and so forth, there's a cause, and it's a systemic cause. It's not a matter of getting the right person in public office. It's a systemic cause. It's getting the right system, and our ancestors pointed to the right system. So that's the show for tonight. Thanks for listening in, and I'll see you next week. No, I won't be with you next week. I'm going to be speaking at a conference, so it'll be the week after that. Have a nice weekend. Thanks so much for listening in. Bye.